Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 97th episode of the Truth Island podcast. An old expression that has managed to attach itself to our society is the one, it's never a good time to have kids. We are often told that every generation has its wars, famines, diseases, and economic hardships that make procreation immensely difficult. And yet, we as a species seem to keep on producing. Nearly all of the Abrahamic religions stress the importance of being fruitful and multiplying. However, a very good question to be asking ourselves is perhaps, why exactly should we? The US Census tells us that among men between the ages of 40 and 50, nearly a quarter are not fathers and will most likely not go on to be fathers. What this means is that nearly 1 in 4 men will not have children. This number has been steadily increasing since the 1950s, when being thought of as a family man was considered a virtue, as employers were less worried that a prospective male hire would get up and run if they had a family to support. With the divorce rate hovering above 50%, it remains no mystery as to why men are becoming less likely to not only marry, but to have children. This number is roughly 9% points lower for women, with only 16% of women reaching middle age without children. With this data in mind, some very important questions begin to emerge. Should everyone be having children? Are there certain milestones that a person should be expected to reach before deciding to have kids? And finally, how we as a society can start removing some of the stigma around men and women who don't wish to have children. Joining me as a part of the 60% of men over the age of 15 who currently do not have kids, I am once again joined by Patrick. So Patrick, I'm noticing a 9% difference between men and women. I'm wondering what's going on there.
A little bit. Times are changing, my friend. I think it's okay these days not to, or at least it's more common not to want to have kids.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I think 1 in 4 is a pretty darn big number. I think that's the highest that it ever has been.
Right.
And I guess I guess I struggle because there is, like if you talk to a biologist, a lot of biologists will say, well, the purpose of us is to procreate or reproduce, like and you actually maybe have a little bit more of a science background, and maybe you could speak to that. Do you think that a lot of this urge is just social conditioning, or do you think that there is a biological imperative for us to keep reproducing as a species?
That is a great question. I think it's probably one through the other. And what I mean by that is there is a biological imperative, and that gets manifested through social conditioning. So, I mean, nobody really wants to admit it, but the reason that we do most of what we do is to have sex, and I think, sex feels good. And so we don't think of it like procreating or doing it with the intention of creating a child. But most of the things that we do, getting a good job, being in shape, wearing nice clothes, living in the right city, is to ultimately have sex. And I know that probably sounds like I'm diminishing it to a non-magical experience, but
Oh, you would get
ev-
along. My friend Kenny says life revolves around sex and money, and that's
yeah,
just
and it's really like evolution is a very, very powerful and smart thing. I mean, it's like a force, I guess you want to call it that. And sort of everything we're designed to do is to get us to have sex with somebody, to have a kid. I mean, every organism's main priority is to make more of itself. I mean, that's just what it is. I mean, that's what a virus does. That's what fish do. That's what we do.
I get, yeah, us human viruses need to spread around the ecosystem
Yeah.
that we're
Yeah.
inhabiting. You actually made me think of something that's super obvious. I'm actually like hitting myself on the back of the head, is that I noticed that these trends in not having children also coincide with birth control, So I'm wondering if maybe birth control allows us to kind of satisfy our biological itch without that extra step of having a child as a result.
Sure. I mean, yeah, that's exactly what it's for. I think some people would, I mean, you have your uber religious types who think that birth control is wrong for a variety of reasons, both like ethical, moral, and otherwise. But the reality is, what separates us from a lot of species is, of course, we do things for pleasure. We're not the only people who do that. We're not the only species that do that. And so sex is one of those things that, someone like myself, I don't want kids. I happen to love kids, but I don't want any myself. There's too many in the world as there is. But I enjoy sex at the same time. And so I can separate the two. I know I'm driven by these feelings of sexuality ultimately because my genes want me to make a kid.
Mm.
I'm just going to ignore them.
Now, this is very important what you're saying, because, sometimes you have this conversation with other people and they refuse to believe you at your word. And this is something that I find very frustrating. Like, I'm going to be honest, I don't have any idea. I have no idea what I want in that domain. But a lot of people think that if you don't want to have children, there's something fundamentally wrong with you, or that you're speaking a different language, or it's like, no, 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 you truly don't know what it is that you want. Eventually it'll click. And
Right.
and I
Right.
I kind of think that that's quite annoying, and I think there's a bit of condescension. It's a condescending attitude to have with somebody, to say that they are not the master of their own thoughts, or they are somehow not in charge of their mental faculties. I'm wondering how you deal with those people, Patrick.
Yeah, I tend to ignore people like that. I think people, for some reason, decide to fall on either side of this issue. I just in the middle. On the one hand, there's a lot of people who don't want to have kids, and that's just normal. It's like myself personally, I love children, but that's a terrible excuse to have one. You have to commit so much, and if you bring a child into the world, you owe that child everything. And to be quite honest, I'm just too selfish to do that because I know that I'll either hopefully I will do what's right, but be, miserable in the lack of like, what happens to my life and then go through midlife crisis. Or if I was a lesser person, I would just ignore that child, which happens to so many kids. It's a lot of kids. And this sounds crazy, but there's just too many children in the world. There's too many people. Like I shouldn't be here, but I'm here. And so I think that when people say that, you should want to have children, or people say that, why do you want to have children? It's possible just to sit in the middle. I don't feel the need to have kids, and I don't care if people think it's weird. A lot of people have kids for the complete wrong reasons, and they shouldn't be having kids. I could make a stronger case for that people have kids for the wrong reason.
Oh, we'll,
And
we'll definitely be going into
yeah,
there. Don't
I
worry,
mean,
my friend. We're gonna get there.
yeah, I
Um,
mean, it's better not to have kids at all than have kids for the wrong reason because you're essentially bringing a soul into the world and throwing them into a terrible situation. And
we're going to slowly walk our way into that territory. So I
okay,
think
sure.
one fallacy of thought that keeps coming up, like you described yourself a second ago as being like selfish or whatever. A lot
Mhm.
of people will make the argument of like, yeah, when you're single, we're all selfish. Like that's just how it is. And then boom, a child pops into the world, and suddenly like core and fundamental personality qualities about yourself are just going to magically change, just
Right.
magically change. And I think that's kind of like not a very realistic thing to think, right? Like I was speaking to a therapist on this program a few episodes ago, and she said that your certain core things about yourself pretty much solidify at the age of 25. Like you are who you are in terms of your personality at the age of 25. So I scratch my chin and think to myself, geez, it's kind of weird to believe that core fundamental personality qualities are just going to change upon having a child.
I mean, it's possible. You go through a lot of biochemical changes. Every person, every good friend of mine or relative that's had a kid has said it's the best thing they've ever done. And I believe them. I really do. But
Mm.
they all wanted to have children. So
Ah.
it's quite possible that you and I could have a kid and we have this epiphany like, oh my God, this is the best thing I've ever done. That is 100% possible. But I don't want to take that chance because what if it's not? And suddenly I brought this child into the world and I'm not 100% devoted to them. I mean, I would hopefully do the right thing. And, I tend to believe that you're not married literally or figuratively to anyone. You can walk away from anyone except your kid because
Mm.
you brought them here. So you owe them that.
Now that's interesting what you said, that the people who think that it's the best thing that ever happened to them, well, they're kind of living a self-fulfilled prophecy. They
Sure.
wanted to have children. They thought that children would bring them happiness, and
Mhm.
then the prophecy came true. So I think that that's a really smart lens that we should be looking at. This is like, who exactly is telling us this?
Yeah, I think that people will tend to justify anything. It's like the same people who say there's a reason for everything. Well, essentially, they're saying that because ultimately, whatever heartache you're going through, you'll get over it. Something good will happen, and you'll say to yourself, hey, this good thing happened because I went through that rough time.
Hmm.
But they're not related to each other. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with looking at it that way. It's a good way to sort of like get over your past. And if that helps you, do that. But as far as children go, some people were born to have families, to be moms and dads. I do believe that. They love what they do. They, there's a maternalism or a paternalism about them that they desperately want that. I don't identify with that because I just don't want to have children. Although I love kids, I have nieces and nephews, and I love them as much as I can love anything. However, I think that people are often not honest with themselves. I mean, it's more difficult for women, obviously, because they have a limited time within which, and they have a ton of social pressure
Oh yeah,
acting
yeah,
on.
way worse, way
So
worse.
it's complicated to be a woman who doesn't have children because you're getting it from all angles. You're getting it from your friends, either overtly or covertly. You're getting it from your family, most likely. As a guy, there's something, I found as I've gotten older without being married or having kids, there's something charming about that. People think it's hilarious. They're like, you're still single with no kids? Oh, what an interesting guy. I didn't do anything. I just, just didn't get married.
So it's like a pseudo asset for us, right? Like, yeah,
Yeah,
I'm,
I
I'm a
mean,
cool, I'm a
in a
cool,
way,
I'm a cool uncle, right? Like that. I think
yeah.
there's like, yeah, I do feel for women. I feel like they do get the raw end of the stick on
Mm,
that one, and I
for
have
sure.
to say that's not right. I'm wondering, like, with this, like, I feel like we have all of these like personality tests. I don't even like personality tests. I think that there needs to be a lot more work in, because you and I are highly self-aware of who we are. Like, we've done a lot of investigation, a lot of reading, a lot of soul searching, and to arrive at that, like the thing you just said a few minutes ago, like, hey, I'm kind of like really into the things that I'm into. That takes a lot of investigative work, and it takes a lot of maturity, and it takes a lot of soul searching to come to these conclusions. I think we need to do a lot more work in creating personality tests and sort of other kind of metrics to help people kind of discover what it is that they want out of life. We do that. We have like the big five. We have all of these personality tests. But when it comes to the most fundamental decisions in life, marriage and having children, nothing. There's nothing there to actually guide you and inform you of whether this is a good choice for you or not.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I think that with our society, and by that I mean the West, I don't mean America per se, there's no transition into adulthood. There's no rite of passage. I mean, we have like these ceremonies, but they're just ceremonial. They don't mean anything. And
Yeah.
so I think we are stuck with a society, and I'll throw myself in here, of children, basically, people who never graduated into adulthood. And so it's sort of like somebody getting married at 21 is insane to me
Yes, in New York,
because only
in the
because
land of New York, that is insane. Okay.
I would argue anywhere, and here's why. I know that people can love each other their entire lives. I do not doubt that, and so I'm not poo-pooing that. I think that you have so much growing to do through your 20s, and there's things that you should be doing. Like, you should be alone, you should travel, you should experience difficult things, you should have your heart broken. I'm going through a difficult breakup right now with somebody who was in their early 20s, and part of the reason I think that it's so difficult for me is because we're not speaking the same language on a lot of things, because I've
Yeah.
been through 20 years of other things and she has not. And so it's sort of like we've reached an impasse where we couldn't see eye to eye on things, and that's nobody's fault. And so I think that in lieu of a personality test, people need to experience the world more, and they need to travel more, and they need to have more experience before you bring a person into the world, because it's so easy. Making a baby is the easiest thing in the world. In fact, it's the most fun thing in the world. Any
Mm.
idiot can do it. Had a kid on a whim. So think of all the people in the world who are just unhappy by virtue of the fact of who their parents were and the way their parents treated them, and they had no control over that.
I think it's become like a necessity that, to really reach middle class prosperity, it takes a really long time in this country,
Mhm.
much longer than ever before, right? And again, I think of my grandfather, World War II GI, got out of the service, had some kids, worked as a waiter, had a house, owned his house, took out a mortgage, paid off the mortgage, 2 cars, middle class livelihood. And you didn't need college, you didn't need all of these, you didn't have to jump through all these hoops to reach middle class prosperity back then. So I think it was like less damaging to have children back then because it was easier in terms of like there was just you could have any type of job, and as long as you put in your 40 hours. You're going to love this one, Patrick. My grandfather was a waiter and he was a part of a union, right? At that time, waiters were actually unionized and they actually,
Right. Yeah.
had certain benefits and so forth. And I think that as we've tragically gotten away from that, it's impossible to really have kids, I think, in your 20s, unless you're like super, like, unless you're like Prince Harry or one of these whatever guys or something. Like, if you're just a regular schmo, there's no way that you have one, the financial like resources to really make that happen. And two, I actually agree with you. I think that you need at least a decade of journey and of exploration to see who you are, what try yourself in trying yourselves in different roles and in different positions and seeing exactly what sticks. Whereas I think that people that just have children at like 21, it's like, well, they never got to see what was out there. They never got to see
Right.
what was over the mountain. And
Yeah.
maybe they don't like what's on the other side of the mountain. Maybe it's terrible and god awful. And they're like, no, 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 I'm ready to have kids. But I think every man owes it to himself to see, and every woman, perhaps for as long as possible, to see what's out there and then make an informed decision. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I think just make an informed decision.
Yeah. I agree with that 100%. The benefits of travel are endless, but first and foremost, it does allow you to transition into this adulthood state that I was talking about that would make you a better parent, frankly. I think that a lot of people, especially if you come from a small town and maybe you didn't go to college, that's the life that you think lays down the road for you. And so that's the one you take. I can't argue with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I think with the resources that we in America have, you are doing yourself a disservice, and you'd be a better parent if you went out and had these experiences and you became a wiser person and you went out and lived your life. Because I think people have these midlife crises, and that's a result of not doing these things in your youth. I think you get married right out of college, or you get married in your early 20s, and then suddenly you're a woman or a man in your late 30s and you're like, God, I didn't really do much. Like, what did I miss? And you'll start to feel these pulls in different directions. I always think of the dog from Call of the Wild, where he's like inside the house and he can hear the other dogs howling and he gets, this anxious feeling. And that happens to people. I think that happens to people as well. And, again, I'm talking on one side of the extreme. There's a lot of people who are wonderful parents and they're perfectly happy. I have
Oh
no
yeah.
doubt.
No,
So I'm not
absolutely.
disparaging that one bit. I mean, talking from a personal stance, I think my character has changed so much because of the travel I've done. And I don't mean like going off and sitting on a beach in Thailand. I've done some really difficult travel where I didn't want to be there and I hated every second of it. But it taught me something and I saw the world. And now I can kind of look through different lenses when I need to. I mean, you see a lot of crazy poverty if you go to certain places. And boy, does that make you think about having kids, because you see these children running around digging through trash heaps. I've seen this in Asia and even parts of like Eastern Europe. And it hits you hard. And you think about that. Like if I were to ever have a kid, I would really want to provide for that kid.
Absolutely. I think that sometimes I've seen so many children that even in America, not to the point of digging through trash and starvation, okay, not at that level, but I've seen so many children that are just poorly taken care of.
That's
That
almost as bad. That
yeah,
is equally as bad.
yeah, absolutely. And it's well, we'll get to that in a moment, but it's very interesting what you said about this traveling and stuff. And this actually is it's funny how all these podcast episodes I seem to be doing seem to feed into one another. The very last podcast that I recorded, we even talked about like the Amish who, ultra religious, love, have children, multiply, but even they take their young men at 19, 20 and say, you're going to go out for 4 or 5 years. You're going to have fun. You're going to do crazy stuff. You're going to go drive a car and do whatever. And then you're going to make a decision about what it is that you want to do. So even the Amish and ultra religious communities get that. They actually get that is a vital stage of development, to go out and be wild and to really learn who you are. And then it's more consensual, I think. I think that if you're forcing somebody to have a kid at like 19 or 20, it's kind of like student loan debt. It's like you're not really in a mental state of mind to make an appropriate decision. You don't really know jack about anything. And I'm like, I think to give you a fighting chance, they ought to give you at least like 5 or 6 years into your 20s to at least figure out what the hell, what the hell the world looks like. And then you will actually have a fighting chance of making the right choice.
I agree totally. I love that Amish thing, the Rumspringer. I mean, it's so, ironically, it's so forward thinking because, well, they're giving you the choice. They're saying, listen, if you want to be here, it is your choice. And I have a lot of respect for that versus other insular / religious communities who have traditions that just sort of like covertly discourage people from leaving. And, you have to like leave a religion. I think that puts people in this state of mind. Whereas when you have an open door and they're like, listen, you can leave whenever you want, then you are there because you want to be there. And that's a healthy way to do it.
Absolutely. And it's funny because they have that kind of like relaxed revolving door type thing for at least a number of years.
Right.
Like 90% do end up coming back, and
Of course.
and then, because because the idea behind this is that when you threaten, first off, right, 90% turnover is beautiful. I mean, to get
That's
90,
incredible.
that's incredible turnover right there. And then that 10%, well, your community is probably better off that you don't have 10% of men who really don't want to be there being there. I think
Right.
as I get older, I realize one of the most damaging things that we can do is force people to do stuff they don't really want to do. I think that is the source of all conflict and tension and so forth. So I think they just also have confidence in the style of living that they have. That they're like, they're going to come back. Believe it's not that great out there.
or they say, if they don't come back, then they shouldn't be here, because they're not going to contribute to the community. I mean, it's a beautiful metaphor for a lot of things, but particularly love, and not to go off the trail too far, but basically if you really truly love somebody, you in a sense set them free and give them the option to be there or not. And that is how you show people you love. And I think you could make an argument that the Amish show these people that they love them by giving them freedom.
Yeah.
And then look what happens. 90% of them come back. I mean, that is an amazing stat.
Yeah, that is. They should definitely be proud to put that in like Python or R, one of these things. All right, I wanna get into like some of the dark territory here.
Let's do it.
And this is where our teaching experience comes in. 10 years, 9 years. I've had my first parent teacher conference, I had about 150 kids in my caseload, 150 kids. And I remember that very first parent teacher conference, I had about 3 parents come and visit me. And those 3 parents were actually the kids that were doing just fine. And that was it. And I did not hear anything else. I made phone calls, I called, I did everything in my power to get in contact with these parents, especially the parents who had children that were really struggling. And I think the world needs to hear this because, there is this myth, and it's actually a myth that's actually addressed in Tolstoy's book called Anna Karenina. Please, everyone, read it immediately. And the myth goes that like every mother loves their child. Okay. And this is a sacred cow right now that we're going to touch, right? How every mother loves their child. Well, Tolstoy in this book, Anna Karenina, talks about a woman who abandons her child and ends up committing suicide, and just throws herself underneath a train. Sorry for the spoiler there. And this book was, when this book hit Russia, oh my God, people went crazy. They were like, how dare you put this in a book, Mr. Tolstoy, and so forth. I've thought about that book, and when I've been in parent-teacher conferences, I think about it all the time. I've had parents just hang up on me. I've had parents just like be like, I'm busy. I've had parents tell me I don't give a shit about what my kid is doing. I don't,
Right.
just leave me alone, leave me alone. And sometimes I would call their house number, man. And it's like, if I'm calling your house number, it's safe to say you're probably not at work, right? And this is obviously before COVID. So like you're at home. It looks like you got a bunch of free time right now. I'm calling you with some really important information about your kid. It seems like you don't really care all that much about what's going on. And I think that this is an ugly truth that we must start grappling with as a society. Because I think right now we're under the paradigm that every parent loves their kid, and I'm sorry, it's just not true. Like my 10 years have taught me it's just not true. There are some very, very selfish parents out there.
Yeah. Well, any idiot can have a kid. It's the easiest thing to do. There's no guarantee. I mean, you would think that the necessary emotions would kick in because you're bringing somebody to the world. But I think the reason that there's so much strife and unhappiness historically, not just today, but forever, is because not only do people who shouldn't have kids, they also, in a sense, just take all their shit and then they just dump it on their children. And then
Mhm.
the cycles, it's been going on for tens and thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands. And I think the world would be a much better place if people just thought about having children. I mean, not to disparage homeless people whatsoever, because I have tremendous sympathy for them. But you see a lot of pregnant homeless people, which makes sense. People will chide them for that. But, I'm sure one of the only comforts they have in an awful world for them is sex with other people. But then they get pregnant and they're bringing a child into this awful situation, like this terrible situation. And so what do you do? It's a tricky one. But then it's like you said, like I had the same experience, although probably a little bit less while I was teaching. Some of these people just should not have had kids, and that sounds awful, obviously, but it's not the kid's fault. It's just you have people who really weren't designed to have children. I mean, we have this thing in Western society. You grow up, you go to college, you get a job, you get married, have kids. And because nobody questions that, and because that's just like gospel, you get a lot of shitty parents. That's just the reality of it.
Yeah, and I wanna really think about what we're saying and how we could potentially correct this, because it definitely needs correcting. I imagine, with a lot of these kids who have parents that are just completely aloof and apathetic and so forth, I imagine like how things could have been different if those parents would have, because a lot of these parents are young, like, I was teaching teenagers. So sometimes you would have parents, as young as like 36, 37, 38. And it's like when you
Right.
do the math, you're like, okay, you had a kid, in your early 20s, or maybe even late teens. And I always think to myself how radically different their life would have been if they would have just taken their 20s, right? Just taken their 20s, had some fun. And then, I'm not, maybe they would have decided not to have kids, or maybe they would have been able to work their way to a economically viable place. Because I think a lot of these parents who are working really crappy jobs that they hate, and they feel stuck. And what ends up
Yep.
happening is that these parents have kids at a young age, and then in order to support that child, they have to take whatever job is available to them at that particular moment, which is
Yeah.
typically not the best options available. And what ends up happening is they end up seeing their child as an object of resentment. Like, you're the thing that's preventing me from being a physicist or whatever. You're the thing that's preventing me from being an actor or an actress. They see their child comes to embody all of the things that they wish that they could be. And I saw so much of that going on. And I always wonder of like, geez, this whole travesty could have just been prevented if you would have properly lived out your 20s and actually found out who you were.
Right. Well, let's go even darker and talk about.
I don't know if it
Um,
can get any darker.
well, we can get there. If we go to a lower socioeconomic scale, so these are people who don't have the resources in their 20s to go out and live their lives. They don't get an education, whatever it may be. So we're talking the children of people who shouldn't have had children. That's an even more disturbing thing, because where do you even start with that? Usually it's like two teenagers are seeing each other or whatever it is, they have sex, and then the girl gets pregnant, and then her life is essentially not ruined, but it's set out before her. Like before she has a chance to do anything, she's now saddled with the ultimate responsibility. And so the question becomes, where do you interrupt the system? Where do you interrupt this cycle? And maybe that is a function of, I don't know, early education or being straight with your kids. I mean, it all, of course, stems from your relationship with your children. I feel like if you have a very healthy relationship with your children, the chances of your children making a mistake like getting pregnant or getting someone else pregnant probably drops off precipitously. I have no data to back that up, but my feeling is that if you talk to your kids and you have a good relationship with them and you listen to them, that I think the chances of them ending up in a situation like that just are less.
Now, I'm curious to get your perspective because, I taught in public school, you taught in private school. And
Mhm.
from what I gathered, and I'm thinking back to my own sex ed classes, and I never taught sex ed, but it seems like in these sex ed classes, there's no they're not allowed to really tell you like you should be doing this first before having children. It kind of
Right.
just they can teach you about condoms, which I think is great. They can teach you about birth control, they can teach you about plan B. Like they're allowed to teach you all of they can give you all the tools that you need in order to do this. I don't think that anyone's explicitly allowed to say, hey, you probably want to wait until you're after 25, or you want to wait
Right.
until you have completed college, or that you have a career and you've been working at that kind of stuff is kind of taboo. And I don't, I don't know if you would get fired for saying that. I don't know what would happen, but for whatever reason, teachers are very uncomfortable just having these like point blank discussions, because there probably will be an angry parent that will fight back and say, how dare, like, my young so and so is set to get married when she's 19 and have 3 kids, and that's just the way it is. So there's like a cultural barrier where it's like we can teach you the tools and so forth, but we can't pass any judgment. And I think that the sex ed teacher should be allowed to say, hey guys, here's some stats. Here's some stats about poverty, and here's some stats about having kids before you reach these milestones and thresholds. Again, I don't believe there should be any legislation or anything, crazy stuff like sterilization or whatever. Like we all have free will and we all have free choice. But I think at the very least, make the statistics available. Make the statistics available.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that seems even like it might not even be effective enough. I think you need like a radical change to the whole way we do things. I think the first and foremost is that Americans in particular have this really hilariously Victorian relationship with sex where, you can show people getting all sorts of murder and crime and violence on TV, no problem. But Janet Jackson bears one of her nipples, and like the place loses its mind. Like America goes crazy. And so because there's this taboo around sex, there's no straight talk about it. And I think that is one of the just like huge problems, is that we can't talk about these things. How are you supposed to address it? How are you supposed to educate a kid? Like, should I ever have kids, which is probably not going to happen, but let's say I have a daughter, which would just be so fitting, right? I would tell her, like, look, a lot of these guys in their early teens, late teens are just trying to have sex with you because that is what's on their mind right now. You shouldn't take it personally. They're not bad people. They're just little balls of hormones that are just trying to impregnate you, even though they don't want to do that. But that's what their genes are telling them to do. And she would have to be smart about it. I think also there's a component, we'll get even deeper, is that,
Sorry, I think you're sounding like a great father right now.
yeah. That thing is, ironically, I think I'd be a great dad, but that's a terrible excuse to have a kid. I think that if you can convince a little kid early, this is getting way off topic, but it all does tie together. If you can convince somebody that to be loved is a bonus in life, and that it's not a completion, you're not looking for somebody to complete you. In fact, it's impossible. Then that person's idea of sex will be so much different, because I think we all do different things for different reasons in terms of love and sex, right?
Mm-mm.
Some people need to have a girlfriend or boyfriend. Some people don't want to. Some people will go out and get drunk and have sex with people because they're fulfilling some need, right? And that need always extends to there's something inside us that we're trying to fill up with some sort of thing. And often people will use other people to do it. They'll use sex, and they'll use what they think is love, but it's not love. It's actually codependence, and it's just this form of like it's a need that they're fulfilling. And I think if you can shape a kid to be healthy in that department and teach them what love actually means,
Mm.
their understanding of how to use sex in their life would change radically, and their chances of getting pregnant would drop to probably zero.
I think so. You've made some really great points here, Patrick. And I think one, um, I think that you're like a parent's. I like how you said that we as Americans have like a shyness about sex, and
Oh, it's crazy.
that might be preventing a father from taking a banana and showing his son how to put a condom on it or whatever. And I'm like, listen here, dude, you need to get over your shyness and teach
Right.
your kid about this banana and this condom here, because you don't want your son to impregnate a girl when he's 19 years old in his sophomore year of college, and his life chances are just flushed down the toilet. So that's a fundamental responsibility of parents. I think you're right. I think that, like, I'm immediately going to, what can the state do? But you know what, though, I don't really like the state coming in and having to do all of this. I think having a parent in the household that can actually be like, hey, son, I don't want to see you having a kid before 25 or whatever. You need to achieve X, Y, and Z. That needs to start happening in households once again. Or
Sure.
I say once again, I don't know if it ever did happen in households. It needs to start happening. And that shyness factor needs to completely, like, we need to just have these very point blank. And a lot of these conversations, Patrick, they're like 2 hours. I'm like, you could have a 2-hour conversation with your kid and completely change their life trajectory. Do you know how incredibly easy that is? What a freaking
Sure.
trade-off. You'll
Sure.
never get a return on investment like that. 2 hours for shaping the entire trajectory of a child. That's amazing.
Yeah, and you could go even further than that and say that if you just talk to your kids often and honestly, I always tried, I'm sure you did the same thing as a teacher, to be like, listen, you can ask me whatever you want. And a lot of times that gets interpreted as like, oh, this guy's trying to be like Mr. Cool teacher. And I was like, no, honestly, like as long as it's not inappropriate or illegal, I'll answer it, because you guys are kids and you're curious about stuff, and you deserve an answer.
Yeah.
So they would ask me about drugs and things like that. And I try to give them a very like objective answer that would answer their question, because what you don't want is you don't want a bunch of kids who are armed with incorrect knowledge or none at all going off. I mean, I think about my relationship with alcohol started at 15, and I was getting super tanked on Friday nights. I mean, it's a terrible way to learn to do it. Whereas if somebody had sat me down, or if alcohol had been in the household and my parents taught me to be responsible about it, I probably wouldn't have been doing that. A lot of these behaviors that we see later on that get magnified and that have actual consequences are things that just were taboo. Anything that's taboo is coming up somewhere. And you tell a kid like you cannot drink, they're going to want to drink more.
That's, I mean, I think what we're doing on this podcast is fantastic, because we are going into some murky taboo territory. But I'm like, well, you can't be afraid of anything in this world, because if you're
Yeah.
afraid of talking about certain issues, well, then negative outcomes are going to continue to happen. The only way that you can combat these negative things from happening is by having dialogue and having discussions. So I think that in our culture and in our society, there should be no shyness. And I think that I don't know, Patrick, if you were, let's say, a father and had a daughter, right? I mean, I think having a conversation about the pill is probably not a bad idea. Like, I don't know why, there's like that reluctance. It's like, do you really want your daughter to be that girl who's pregnant at 17, 18 years old? And I would say the answer is probably not. But you also realize that they have sexual desires, and right, and like, it's funny, the last episode I did was on abstinence. And okay, is that going to work? Probably not. Like, complete abstinence in your teenage years and young adult years, no. But actually integrating the conversation about how you could fulfill your desires without bringing another life into this world, and then
Right.
combining that with love, well, we're ending cycles of poverty right now just by having these conversations.
Yes, exactly right. You could talk to your kids about, I mean, speaking of love, and that's such an important component, and I typically don't believe in love too much, but a lot of times kids make dumb moves because they're under the sway of intense emotions, right?
Yes.
Teenagers, particularly, they don't know how to handle them. And so when they fall in love, they fall in love hard. And when they break up, it's the worst, it's the end of the world, although it doesn't change really as you get older. But separating sex, like there's a way to sort of talk about sex. It's not clinical, and you can talk about it honestly. And I mean, it's easy for us to talk about this because we don't have kids, and I'm sure that having a conversation with your teenage kid about sex is probably mortifying for the kid, and they don't want to be there. But if you're honest and you're like, look, this is for your own good, and at some point, if I had a daughter, I'd be like, some point you're going to feel very strongly for someone you're going to want to have sex with them. I'm like, and I can't control what you do. And it's sort of like you use the Amish trick where you're like, listen, you do whatever you want because you're your own person and I'm not going to be there to stop you, obviously. But just think about the consequences of that. If you get pregnant, your life is over, meaning like you'll never get to go out and do those things you want to do. If you get an STD, you'll carry that around forever, if not worse. And so there's a way to like demonify this so that kids don't feel, because like kids hate talking about this stuff because they think their parents are idiots and they don't understand, and yet at the same time they're terribly confused about all the things they're experiencing and they don't know how to process those things. And so a lot of times we're left to our own devices, and that's why we're all such messes, right? Because you have to figure this stuff out on your own. A lot of the stuff you don't figure out correctly and you make the wrong assumptions, and so we're all carrying these things from childhood that affect us into adulthood, and that's not how it should be. And I think it starts with parenting, but it's communication and it's being open, particularly with sex, because sex is like we're so I forget the word I'm looking for, but we're just like we're so prudish in this country about sex. It's ridiculous, and I think it's a holdover from the pilgrims that came over, because there was a religious element to the 13 colonies that sort of this puritanism that is held over today, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work at all.
I agree. I think we need to get over those. Like if we are serious about ending poverty, if we're really, and this is what it comes down to, if we're really serious, then I think we need to have these conversations about like, if you don't want to raise your kid in poverty, here's what you need to achieve first. And here are
Right.
the life experiences. Here's a thing. And I would say, even, as you and I know, even having a college degree is not a golden ticket to anything anymore. So
No.
like, there's a lot of things that need to be in place before you even think about having a kid. And if we don't get over this taboo of having these difficult conversations, the cycle of poverty will go on forever and ever and ever. It'll never break. It'll just
Right.
absolutely never break. Okay, the next thing I want to move on to is, of our, let's say 25% of men or 16% of women, I think a part of this also is stigma, right? So a lot of people, and I think women are very vulnerable to this at the age of around 35 or something, where that stigma, you're going to be an old maid, you're going to be in China they would say you're a leftover woman, like this very nasty language
Yeah.
that we kind of have over this. I think removing that stigma is also going to be very beneficial, because I think a lot of, especially women, they get into that 35, 36, age range, and they just chase whatever guy is out there. He could be a complete douchebag or whatever. They chase the first guy that they see, and they're just like, well, the stigma of not having a kid is far worse than marrying this douchebag or whatever it is.
Right.
That needs to change, and it needs to change ASAP, because I think that a lot of women are being pressured into hooking up, with whatever is available. And what ends up happening is that they don't really, like, there's probably a reason why they reach the age of 35, 36 without having kids. They maybe just don't want to have it. But now this stigma is forcing them to do something that they don't really want, and they're not really prepared to do, or they haven't found the right person to do it with. And that's actually going to, I think, mitigate misery completely if we start scrubbing a lot of these stigmas and stereotypes off people's plate. I think once we start doing that, then people are going to have much more free will in how they decide to live their life, and subsequently not bring children into this world who then also go on to live miserable lives because they're not being properly cared for.
Yeah. That's a pretty tall order, but I think you're talking about social convention, which is powerful. We are social creatures. We live in a society, and most people fall under the sway of these conventions. And one of them, for women in America at least, is that if you're not married into your 30s, that's unusual. It's odd. And if you don't have kids, it's the same sort of thing. I think things are certainly better today. But to that, I would say two things. I don't know how you would go about removing the stigma. Again, I think it really has to do with, this will sound strange, but individual character, So
Yeah.
like most people are afraid to go against the grain. They're afraid to do this. And I think at the root of all of that, and this will be an odd twist, is loneliness. I think people are absolutely petrified to be alone.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, it's why people, as you said, get married in their 30s to people they otherwise wouldn't. It's why people get desperate. It's oftentimes why people want to have kids, because there's a loneliness inherent in getting old without a husband and kids. And most people will tell you the greatest thing I ever did in my life was as my children. And then that during Thanksgiving you have your family around you and you want to be on your deathbed with your family all around you. So I can understand the pressures that people feel. I just think that that's a myth, and it's a trick to get people to just fall in line, because there's something about people who go outside of the norms that make other people uncomfortable. Whether it's women who don't have children, and like I said, to be a man in your 40s and 50s, like a bachelor, is rather charming. You're looked down like a George Clooney. No one's ever compared me to George Clooney, but like that's that quality. He's like, oh, he's just, he's got a twinkle in his eye, and he knows what he wants out of life. So he never found the one to settle. He didn't want to be tied down, and it's seen as a virtue. They're like, it's seen as like like, oh, he's got character, he's got confidence. Whereas if a woman, they're like, what the hell's wrong with her? Why isn't she married? And I think it's a total double standard, and it's unfair. But it's only because women, of course, are saddled with this biological thing where they can only have kids for X amount of years. And so all the pressure falls on them. So they're like, if they're not having kids, like you and I can impregnate someone on my deathbed. It'll be a hell of a way to go out, right? But I can essentially. A woman has a window that she is can have kids in, and so that creates these crazy pressures for them. And I really do feel bad for women in that regard. I think that women in their 20s kind of are on top of the world because they're young and beautiful, and basically a lot of things are easier for that. But then when they hit their 30s, the pressure hits. I read this article one time, and it was by a very, very famous swimsuit model in the 80s. And she said that when she got to 50, she became invisible. And I
Yeah.
thought that was interesting, because society values the young, beautiful woman, and then they sort of discard the older women who've lost their sheen, right? And so I think there's a lot of crazy pressure on women, kids, and to not do that shows real character.
That's, it is cruel. And I think us guys have the complete opposite. When you're in a bar when you're 20, no girl wants to talk to a dude that's like younger than her and is
No.
still in the like middle of college or something. Like, but then you turn like 50 and you got like that nice gray beard or whatever and
Yeah,
salt and pepper hair,
get a little
and it's
money in the bank and
yeah, yeah. Then
woo-hoo.
then suddenly you're like, oh wow, this guy's of value. Okay, I want to jump into some of these. Like, I think loneliness is at the heart of this, and I think you're
Yes.
right. You've actually identified exactly the variable that's scaring people. So I think the easiest way to dispel this is to say having kids is no guarantee of not being alone. I think that's
No.
the easiest way to kind of dispel this myth, because one, you can have kids, and then I've known you can get a divorce, so your husband's gone or your husband's out of the picture or whatever, like, right? So that's no guarantee. And I hate to say it, there's a lot of older folk who their kids move away to a different state and
Mhm.
and don't really, it's having a kid is not some kind of magical insurance policy that when you turn 80 they're going to be at your beck and call, getting you warm milk and cookies. Like, they might be, hey, I'm out to California, I'm out to Florida, Oregon, whatever. So there's no guarantees that having kids is going to make sure that you have, perpetual care and perpetual, Thanksgiving or whatever. Yeah, it might be nice to have someone in your life that could take power of attorney if it ever got to that level, but By that point, you're probably so jacked up on morphine and out of it that you have no idea what the hell's going on. Like, and there's so many, so like I say that like that is the easiest thing to look at here, is that when you have kids, don't do it because you think that you're going to get, like, it's not interest. When you have a child, this is not like compound interest that when they turn 25 and they graduate from medical school, now you have this wonderful trophy to be proud of that's going to take care of you forever. There's no guarantees of that in life at all. None
Yeah,
whatsoever.
yeah,
Your kid could be a total screw up and none of that stuff actually ends up happening. So I think that people have to decide to have kids, not because they're fearful of the future, but because it's actually an endeavor that they want to partake in.
sure, totally. I would go further and say people need to at least face their loneliness if they want to be happier in life, just in general. Because I think most of life's problems or most of life's ills and kind of down times come from either the fear of loneliness or loneliness itself. And
Mm.
loneliness is merely just a fear that you're going to be alone forever. And a lot of people don't have practice with it. And when they taste it, it's horrifying to them. And so children nor a family, nothing. I mean, I've heard it said, and I believe it, that um, being married to someone who is ignoring you is the loneliest place you can be ever. It's like it's lonelier than not having anyone at all because you're truly alone. And there's just no magic pill. And again, I think there should be no reason to have a child except that you just have a child. I mean, some people they want to have children and they want to have a families and they're very happy. And so I of course believe it's possible, and I think that those people are lucky to have found something to give them meaning in life that makes them happy.
Yes, I think you're right. You can actually feel alone with a whole family,
Oh,
a
for
lot
sure.
because
Yes.
you could if you don't, let's say you don't love your husband or you don't love your wife, okay? Well, you're going to feel alone in that moment. You're not
Mhm.
really loving your kid and not really bonding with them or whatever. You got an angry teenager in the house who slams his door or whatever, doesn't want anything to deal with you, and you're like, "Oh man, this kid's preventing me from being a whatever." So, you could be just as isolated and just as alone in that scenario as you would be a bachelor in a studio apartment. The same level of loneliness is happening. And one of the things that I've discussed on previous episodes of this podcast is just because you are surrounded by bodies does not mean that you are not alone. That is
Yeah.
completely false. You can surround yourself, you can go to many parties and surround yourself. I've gone to many parties, been surrounded by tons of bodies, especially in the lower West Village or whatever. You go to one of these bars and you got that stupid bracelet that they put around your wrist, and you're like a pig to a watering hole just trying to get fed. It's like
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can like brush against as many bodies as you want. That's not going to fill your loneliness void at all. That's not going to make a
Yeah.
difference. And I
No.
think I think you're right. And I think that maybe you and I can only speak for myself, but I've spent a lot of time alone and I actually learned to love myself while being alone. And maybe that is the thing that every young man and woman needs to do, is they need to first love themselves in complete isolation and in complete loneliness. And then once they've mastered that, then and only then could they even think about having children.
I think that's a beautiful way to put a cap on all this. If you can
Absolutely.
really, and it sounds so like Oprah to say this, but truly, nobody takes the time, or very few people want to do that because it's difficult to be alone in your apartment. I mean, take now for example, we're all in the middle of this pandemic, and a lot of us are alone much more often than we would otherwise be. And having just broken up with somebody, I'm suddenly thrust into this new existence where whereas I would usually be spending time with somebody, now I'm alone all the time with the added fact that, I'm dealing with the breakup itself. But it's been really, really good for me because I've decided like I need to master being alone. And so there are times like a complete weirdo, I'll sit in my apartment with the TV off, sit on the couch, and I'll just sit there and all these anxieties will come up about like, oh, you're alone, you're such a loser, you're this. And I'll just like sit there and let it all wash over me. And I won't resist because resistance only causes further pain down the road. And like I've had some intensely lonely moments, but it's the healing of this thing that I had. I'd created this thing in my head like I need to be with this person. And when I'm not, I'm upset. And once you need something like that, it's like you said, like you could be with many people and be utterly alone. until you can be with yourself alone and not feel that crazy urge and like that something's wrong, you're never going to be happy. You're just never going to be happy. You might find your soulmate and you love that person, but that is that is a crutch and nothing else. I mean, finding a soulmate's a wonderful thing, obviously, but until you can master being alone, you you're never going to be happy, and you certainly should not have kids. I'll tell you that.
Yes, absolutely. Make sure that the people that if you're seeking out a partner or something, make sure that you're not just doing it so that you're no longer alone. Make sure that you're doing it because that person is your soulmate and the person that you were really meant to be with. And if you can't find that person, then so be it. One person that we can really look up to, I think, is Oprah, since you just mentioned her. She never had
Right.
kids.
That's
And
right. Exactly.
something tells me that if Oprah had kids, she may never have gotten the chance to become Oprah. Uh,
Exactly right.
Patrick, thank you so much for being on the show today.
It's a pleasure to be on.
This concludes the 97th episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azarad.